Hello and welcome to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I am, as always, so grateful to have you here with me today. How are you doing? How are we all? It's like summer 2.0 here. I'm very hot and bothered. I was really ready to get my pyjamas out and to get my autumn decorations out because I am one of those people that decorate for every season. Don't come for me. I was ready with the pumpkin spice and now it's 34 degrees when I get in my car and I know that's on me. Anyway, I am just popping in because obviously last week was the first part of our Snow White episode along with the wonderful Missy, and I hope you guys have really enjoyed that. So today is part 2. And we're going to kick it off by talking about the Grimm brothers version of the tale, have a little chat about Disney and how Snow White theoretically made the Disney studios what it is today, and then we're going to talk about how Snow White appears in modern day literature, film, TV and feminist discourse. So you've got all of that lovely stuff to come, but just before we go on to the main episode, I wanted to just let you all know that I've had a little bit of a change up over on the Patreon. There's some new things coming, so if you did want to sign up to that, it's really worth going to do that now. A couple of the bits that I've got coming are things like what I am dubbing the Lore Locker, which is just a little bit of a mini essay every other week, which is going to dive into like a mythological beast or a food or a location or a minor goddess, the sort of things that don't fill up a full episode but are good for a quick read. I'm going to do something called Divine Finds, which is going to be sort of a spotlight on a real world connection to mythology. So that might be things like ancient artifacts and coins and paintings and sculptures, and it will just be a really short bite-sized post with some images, a little caption and some historical and mythological context, and sometimes maybe a little question to ponder over as well, just to get you all thinking. And of course, we do have the Discord server, which is a lovely little space just for people to chat about the episodes, about art that they're doing, books that they're reading, and we do have a book club going on in there too. So please check it out if you want to, but there's absolutely no pressure if you don't. I don't want to bang on about it too much because I know you're here to listen to the second part of the Snow White episode, so I'll just let you get on with that. If you do like the episode, please do feel free to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. You can leave me a comment if your platform allows it, and a review. It really helps this podcast grow, and it's growing very nicely, and that is all thanks to you guys. So I'm going to pass it on back to myself in the past. I will just say, remember, it did accidentally switch over to my AirPods microphone. It actually rectifies itself halfway through this episode, so bear with me and my terrible technology skills. Enjoy! So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go on to the Grimm brothers version of Snow White. So the Grimm brothers version was first published in 1812 under the title Sneewittchen, which is a great word. A great word.
Sneewittchen. I love saying it.
Yeah, you probably say it a lot better than I do.
Don't worry about it. No, I just happen to have just enough German.
Just enough.
Yeah.
This is published in their collection Children's and Household Tales. It's very dark. It's very dark and very symbolic, and it departs in a lot of way from the much more sanitized versions that we know. The Grimms revised the tale again in I think about 1857, and there's and they did another version then, which is often cited as the more definitive text. And the reason that I wanted you to tell us a bit more about themes of dismemberment and disability before we got here is because the Grimms' rendition does an excellent job of preserving all of the cruelty, all of the violence and the punitive elements that reflected not only folklore tradition, but also a lot deeper cultural and ideological undercurrents of 19th century Germany. So the tale begins with the queen who pricks her finger, and you said earlier about this sort of motif of fingers being pricked while sewing, and she wishes for a child with skin as white as snow, red as blood, and black as the wood of the window frame. And you remember back to what we said about that tricolour symbolism. This is that in action.
The child is born, but the mother dies soon after, and the stepmother then comes in, and she's sort of driven by some narcissism, I think, and some envy. And she has this magical mirror, which we all know tells her that she is the fairest of them all, until it doesn't, until it says that actually Snow White is she's prettier than you. And this doesn't make her very happy. And she orders a huntsman to take Snow White into the woods and kill her and bring back her lungs and liver as proof. And this is where it gets a little bit more gory. The huntsman he can't do it. He's really sad. He said, no, just run away, and I'll go and find some lungs and some liver of something else, and I'll bring that back. He brings it to the queen. She cooks it and she eats it, and believes that she's consuming Snow White's vital organs, which is kind of like ritualistic cannibalism. It's very gross, but it's also very symbolic. She wants to absorb, to consume all of the beauty that Snow White had. And that reinforces these themes of like maternal rivalry and like this sort of distorted nurturing. And it reveals that the queen doesn't want to just take out a rival. She wants to assimilate her essence physically and to almost like become her, like I say, absorb her beauty, which is just a bit gross. Not nice.
Yeah,
we're both pulling a face right now. And Snow White finds refuge with 7 dwarfs who represent, like I said, very ambiguous, possibly pre-Christian figures living in liminal spaces, a forested hinterland far away from all of this courtly power structure. And when the queen finds out that Snow White still lives, she disguises herself in 3 attempts to kill her, first with a suffocating lace bodice, then with a poisoned comb, and then with the infamous poisoned apple. And only the last attempt is successful, and Snow White falls into her death-like sleep. And then dwarfs put her in her glass coffin. The prince comes along and he's like, this is a very pretty girl. And when his servants carry the coffin, they stumble and they dislodge a piece of apple from her throat, and it revives her. And then the tale ends a bit brutally, really. At the wedding of Snow White and the prince, the stepmother is forced to wear red-hot iron shoes and just dance until she dies, which is pretty iconic. It's wild, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because again, we've talked about these motifs. They show up in so many different stories. So what's interesting is that, of course, this story ends with the horrible, gory punishing of the stepmother, or actually the mother. So that's you mentioned the different versions.
Yes, yeah.
So apparently in the earliest version it was the mother. Yeah, and then later they were like, because the Grimms revered birth mothers, and they were really not comfortable with having.
They decided to retcon that.
Right,
they will change that. Yeah,
that's right. So they changed it to a stepmother. But what's fascinating about that is that if you go back to, she thinks she's eating her daughter or her stepdaughter early on. So that is actually the punishment given to some evil stepmothers in the Cinderella story, particularly if you look at certain East Asian and specifically, I think, Vietnamese versions. It's at the end of the story, the stepsister is killed and served to the stepmother as punishment for the way she treated Cinderella. And so it's, different points in the story that it takes different roles, but you see that same motif of, it's both taking power and also it is punishment.
It's punishment. Yeah.
So,
it's so interesting to see how these different little elements, even like the little gory elements, actually are found across so many different cultures and different time periods. But in terms of the Grimm collection, the social and political context of that one, you can't really separate it, because in the early 19th century, you're talking a time of sort of romantic nationalism for the German states. And the Grimm brothers, they wanted to recover and create a Volksgeist, which was like the spirit of the people through oral traditions. And their interest in doing all these stories, like we said, was just to, boost German nationalism. And it's about this cultural identity. You're in the wake of like Napoleonic occupation, and the Holy Roman Empire is fragmented, and lots of German intellectuals were very concerned with preserving cultural identity. So collecting and refining these German folk tales was a way to preserve their heritage. So in doing that, the Grimms often took elements, and this is what we said about the dwarfs. they were like, how can we make this German? And they've gone back and they've found things to help boost this idea of these tales. We're putting them together to preserve German heritage.
Yeah.
And they also often edited the tales to reflect this like bourgeois Christian morality, domestic values, and patriarchal order, even while the tales still held a lot of that raw, like pagan and violent elements. So there's definitely some conflict in what they contain, because they do a bit of both, really, I think.
Yeah, and for a little more context for this, I do recommend the book Extreme North by Bernd Brunner. So it's actually, I believe it's translated from Norwegian, but I really liked it. It's a collection of essays just about the concept of North in sort of the popular European imagination for most of history. And it does go into this about how, the Grimms especially, but then obviously much later when you get into, the Nazis and whatnot, they were always trying to sort of pull from Norse history and sort of adopt it as German. And so that's where you see, again, like the dwarfs being a big thing. It was more Norse to some extent, and then sort of pulled into, and becoming more of sort of German culture that the Grimms were trying to build.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. The other thing I want to mention, which is fascinating, is you mentioned that, the meaning in the medieval context and then, later, the religious context, especially of the colors, red, white, black. And I also want to mention, you pointed out that Snow White is kind of a Persephone character a little bit, so she's a little bit of a death goddess. And so the other cultural meanings that you tend to see of those colors are death colors: white for bone, red for blood, and black for earth. So these are colors that would have been associated with literally, again, like a death goddess or a death maiden. So very interesting that is still there, even though that's not necessarily the conscious meaning that would have been attributed to it by the audience.
Yeah, that's really interesting how the connotations of those colors might have changed or been interpreted differently in different time periods by different audiences. It's really, it's very, very interesting. People don't often think about this stuff, and then when you start looking into it, you're like, oh my God, that's very poignant when you put it in context for everything. And as well as this, the tale of Snow White also reflects contemporary gender politics and familial dynamics. You've got this central conflict between the stepmother or the mother and Snow White, and it again helps to dramatize the danger of female vanity and female power. And that's a massively recurring theme in patriarchal storytelling. Even the mirror becomes this symbol of internalized surveillance. The queen is both consumer and consumed by the gaze. And in later editions of the story, the Grimm sort of softened or clarified roles to align more closely with 19th century values. So Snow White became a little bit more passive, and that helped to reinforce this idea of a beautiful but obedient and silent woman. And her awakening through the prince's intervention reinforces heteronormative resolution and the restoration of patriarchal order. This woman can't do anything until this man comes and wakes her up. Which is why I think the story that you told us earlier on is so cool. It wasn't a man; it was a woman, and they, took that nail right out of her head, and they fondled each other, and they had a great time, and they didn't need a man. And the only function that the man had in that was actually to say, do you know what? Actually, I'll make sure that you're allowed to have that safe space. And that you can continue. I think that's so cool.
Yeah, what an ally.
So cool. Yeah, we stand an ally over here. And the Grimm's Snow White, it definitely does draw from earlier folklore. Gian-Battista Basile's Pentamerone, I think I spoke about that in the Cinderella episode, that there's also a tale in there called The Young Slave. And that features similar themes like jealousy, poison, gifts, resurrection. And to go back to what we just sort of talked about, most importantly to the Grimms, there is the story of Brynhilde, who lies in this like death-like sleep, surrounded by flames until the hero comes along. And that certainly would track with what we've just said. They're trying to find things and make them German and make them examples of their rich folklore and cultural identity, which is it's really cool that they literally looked around and said, "Reckon we can make that German if we try." Yep. Yeah, we can make that German.
Like, so wait, let's do Briar Patch instead of Flames. Got it. Let's go.
Yeah. That works. That tracks. Yeah. Ultimately, the Grimm Snow White functions as a bit of a crucible for anxieties about beauty, aging, power, and female agency. And it's not just a children's story, but it's a really dark allegory shaped by folklore, religious dogma, and 19th century social context. It's not a benign fairy tale, and it keeps this really unsettling power through the lens of cruelty, justice, and psychic tensions that are so deeply embedded in human development and societal control. And it also provided probably the most comprehensive story foundations upon which Disney built their version. So what we're going to do now is just have a little look at how that happened and just about the Disneyfication of Snow White. So Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs of 1937 holds such a significant place in cinematic history. It was actually the world's very first full-length cell animated feature film. So its production, its reception and legacy was so critical, not only to the development of animation in general and as an art form, but also to the actual establishment of the Walt Disney Company, as we know now is the biggest force in global entertainment. And though we often look at the film like through this sort of nostalgic lens, we can take a good deep dive into it and see that it was a really rich process of adaptation, of artistic innovation. It was a big risk as well to do this, and they were all influenced by all of this lovely earlier folklore tradition that we've spoken about so far. And as I said, the origins of Disney's Snow White do trace pretty directly to the Brothers Grimm tale. The Disney adaptation primarily drew from that later version that we spoke about with the stepmother, but it did incorporate some of the earlier theatrical traditions that we found in silent cinema. There was actually a live action version of Snow White in 1916 starring Marguerite Clark, and apparently Walt Disney went to see that and he really liked it, and that sort of sowed the seed in his head that was something that he would like to do.
And he would have been a teenager too.
Yeah, he would have been.
Not in 1901. So
yeah. Yeah, so it would have been in his head for a long time. He obviously really, really enjoyed this movie. The early sort of conceptualization began in the early 30s. And at that point, Disney was already quite successful. You had the Silly Symphonies, you had the Mickey Mouse shorts. So people were already into animation, but it was still relatively new. And when he said, look, guys, I want to make a full-length feature film based on Snow White, people said, well, I don't think you should. Critics called it Disney's folly. They really didn't think this was going to work. They really didn't think that an audience would stay interested in a cartoon that was feature length. And as we know now, they were very wrong. They were very, very wrong. And I think Walt Disney knew that they were wrong. And he truly believed that animation could be elevated to a serious level of actual storytelling. And he envisioned Snow White not as a comedic novelty, but as a serious, dramatic, emotional and artistic film. And they began to develop this movie over 3 years, and the story department, I think, took such extensive process of finding all these different narratives and refining them, producing hundreds of pages of storyboards. There's thousands of sketches, of concept sketches. And although the film retained the basic plot and structure of the Grimm tale, it did definitely expand on that and altered the narrative in several ways, by far the most important being the characterization of the Seven Dwarfs, who aren't really about until this point. And they are all names, they're all given their own different personalities. Do you know all of the dwarf names? Do you remember them all?
I might.
I've got it written down.
Yeah, happy, sneezy, bashful, grumpy, dopey. All right, I'm missing two.
It's the one that I always remember. One of them is the one that I always forget.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm forgetting two. What are they?
Doc,
right.
Doc, grumpy, happy, sleepy, bashful, sneezy, and dopey. So okay, that's what they were all called, and they were all given their own personalities, and that was done to give a bit of comic relief. You need a little bit of comic relief, a little bit of emotional impact, and Disney are really good at creating little side characters. That's their thing. And the production of the film was a huge leap in animation techniques. Disney invested heavily in technical training, and he actually established a Disney training program, which was run by someone called Don Graham. And it was there to encourage animators to actually study human and animal anatomy. In the early days of Disney, they did a lot of having an actual live model there to study and draw and to sort of take inspiration from. And I think that really helped with making that animation look really real. And I think when you look back on early Disney animation, you can tell that it's been so painstakingly and lovingly done. And they actually shot a lot of live action footage for reference for many of the scenes, including there was dancer Marge Champion, who was a model, and animators just sat and watched her dance. And that contributed to how lifelike some of the movement and expressions of the characters are.
Mm-hmm.
The background art for all of the landscapes were influenced by European illustrators like Gustav Tengren and Kay Nielsen. And that was reflective of Gothic romanticism, which was meant to sort of visually evoke the Germanic roots of the tale. The Queen's transformation into the old crone was very grotesque, and that drew a lot from German expressionist cinema, things like Nosferatu. The colour palette, the atmosphere, the use of shadows added psychological depth. The aim was to give it sort of a dreamy, otherworldly feel. And as you know, with Snow White, music plays a huge part in it and helps set the tone of the movie. So Frank Churchill and Lee Harleen, they composed songs like Someday My Prince Will Come, Hi Ho, and Whistle While You Work. And those songs, we're talking nearly 100 years later, everybody knows them. They are instantly recognisable. And the film was released in December of 1937 in Los Angeles at the Cathay Circle Theatre, and it was met with so much popular acclaim. Industry people like Charlie Chaplin praised it. He actually said it was a masterpiece of the highest order, and even Einstein deemed it the greatest film ever made. The New York Times said it was a classic in every sense of the word, and it went on to become the highest grossing sound film of its time. It actually got $8 million globally in its initial run. And when you think about it, you are in an era of depression here, and you're getting $8 million from this movie.
When a ticket costs 10 cents.
Yeah. Which is crazy. It's really, really like, to put it into perspective, $8 million when the tickets were 10 cents. Yep. And so that movie completely transformed Disney Studios. The profits from that movie let Walt Disney build his state-of-the-art studio in Burbank, which is still there today, expand into new genres, expand technologies. And it was the beginning of that golden age of animation, leading on to things like Pinocchio, Fantasia, I think, Dumbo, Bambi. Yeah. And probably most importantly to this very podcast, it laid the groundwork for the princess movies and the draw on folktale and mythology. Yeah,
well, when the studio was struggling, they said we have to go back to fairy tales, and that's when they made Cinderella.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So,
and don't get me wrong. I mean, the film's not been without criticism.
Sure,
lots of feminist critics sort of interrogated the gender politics of it all. Snow White's very passive. She's very domestic and idealized, and the prince comes along as a savior. And it's been argued that it reflects 1930s cultural norms that idealized female submission and purity. There is an essay called Someday My Prince Will Come by Marcia Lieberman. And if you can read it, I would recommend it. But basically she writes that, well, there is a quote, Snow White, like most fairy tale heroines, is not the agent of her own fate, but rather a reward for male virtue or the target of female envy. Which is, we knew that. We kind of knew that. But when you put it into the context of the time period, it's not much of a surprise that not a lot was done in terms of trying to give Snow White agency. But however way you look at it, it did transform Disney, and it's more than a pioneering animation. It's definitely complex, and it's right at that sort of like intersection between folklore adaptation and technology development. And it drew from so many centuries of oral and literary traditions, and it was viewed and created through this lens of like American cinema. And I think it definitely helped to redefine the fairy tale and the medium of animation in one, and got people interested, didn't it? In both.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Part of the reason why fairy tales continue to be so popular today is because of the Disney films. Absolutely.
Without a doubt.
Modern interpretations of Snow White span literature, film, television, music, and also critical feminist discourse. That is really indicative of how adaptable this tale is, which we already knew from everything we've already spoken about. These retellings often expose and subvert the original's underlying patriarchal assumptions, while reimagining the characters, especially Snow White and her stepmother, as agents with autonomy, agents of rebellion or critique. From darkly satirical rewritings to feminist interventions in media, Snow White has become a source for debates about beauty, power, gender, and identity. In literature, one of the most influential reimaginings is Donald Barthelme's Snow White of 1967, and this, I haven't read it, so I will say, pre-warning, I haven't read this. I've read about it. This is a postmodern novel which I'm told deconstructs the fairy tale into more fragmented perspectives and satirical commentary on things like consumerism, alienation, and gender roles. And in this book, Snow White lives with 7 dwarfs, not out of necessity, but as part of this like surreal domestic arrangement. And there's a quote where she says that she is tired of being just a housewife. She wants to be a real person. And articles that I've read about this book sort of insinuate that it interrogates like passivity and femininity, and it challenges this notion that purity or beauty entitles a woman to salvation. The prose is loaded with irony and postmodern alienation, and it sort of takes a fairy tale structure and it collapses under its own self-awareness, so to speak. So that's one I probably will read at some point. I just have not. I haven't had a chance. And then you've got The Bloody Chamber of 1979, where the story is written very darkly, a lot of dark eroticism, a lot of gothic power. That one is that whole book, the whole collection is definitely worth reading if you're interested in looking at fairy tales through a different lens.
The audiobook is fantastic too. And like if you want it extra creepy, it's great.
I hadn't even thought of listening to that on audiobook, and I'm an audiobook person, so I should probably I will do that actually. That'll make my drives to and from work interesting. Very interesting. I might wait till it gets dark. When it's dark when I drive to and from work, and then I'll listen to it then.
Then you'll really freak yourself out.
Yeah, then I really will. Then I won't want to go to work. In contemporary poetry, Anne Sexton wrote Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs in 1971 as part of her Transformations collection, and she rewrites Snow White through a very confessional lens and a very feminist lens. She describes Snow White as a dumb bunny and critiques her silence and her beauty and her victimhood. And she says, beauty is a simple passion, but oh, my friends, in the end, you will dance the fire dance in iron shoes. So that's definitely a callback to the Grimm version. And this poem recenters the narrative on all of the grotesque and pathological undercurrents of the original, and takes the figures of Snow White and the Queen and takes them and turns them into sort of twin figures caught in the same oppressive cycle of appearance and punishment, because really they are both caught in the same cycle. Yeah. And then you have so many different film and television adaptations. Snow White is a bit of a vehicle for commentary on the power of gender and gender identity. You've got more recently the 2012 movie Snow White and the Huntsman, which that went some way to sort of frame Snow White, played by Kristen Stewart, as not a passive beauty but as a warrior princess, more armed and more like defiant. And that reminds me a lot of when I spoke about Guinevere and Keira Knightley's portrayal of Guinevere. Very similar vibes. And in that movie, the Queen, who's played by Charlize Theron, is not just like this evil caricature. She's also a victim of patriarchal exploitation, and her aging body is like symbolic of the fact that her power is also threatened by Snow White. She's
a tragic figure in that
she
movie.
Is, yeah, absolutely. And I read a really interesting sort of like feminist take on it by Pauline Greenhill, and I'll put the link into the show notes. And she said that this movie is a feminist misreading of the fairy tale, one that recasts Snow White not as a submissive girl, but as a Joan of Arc figure whose authority must be forged through violence. That's a good article. I will put that in the show notes for anyone that wants to have a little read. But that movie was criticised quite a lot. Criticised for being marketable feminism, very superficial feminism, which is sort of an empowerment narrative that leaves the underlying gender hierarchies unchallenged. And it's like you take the main character and you give her a sword or a bow and arrow and call it feminism. I think a lot of people took from that movie.
The movie Mirror Mirror does the same thing. And where it's a fairly faithful Snow White retelling, that she ends up in the forest with the dwarves, and the dwarves teach her how to fight, among other things. And so then her first encounter with the prince in the forest after she's fled there is a sword fight, and it's cute, and I like it, but at the same time, it's just, all they did was just give this character a sword.
They gave her a fight montage.
Exactly.
It can be a bit like that. It is quite superficial, and it doesn't do a lot to challenge the underlying reason for why Snow White was initially the way that she was, or why the female character was like that. But then you can open up a whole conversation about like marketability, and like, I'm sure when they're putting these movies through whatever checks and readings and third readings and whatnot, they have to, it's got to be marketable, hasn't it? And I think sometimes that comes before sending a proper message. As much as I would prefer it to actually send the proper message, I would love to see that.
Well, I think the last thing I'll mention about this is that with some of these, they're still having this problem today, I would argue, because I don't know if you saw the movie Damsel based off of the book.
I've seen it, trailers of it, but I've not actually watched it.
So I've read the book and I also watched the movie. The book is amazing, highly recommended. You want to talk about a really good feminist takedown of fairy tales? That's a good one. Like it's very satisfying. So I definitely recommend it. But the film they made off of it, they took quite literally all of the teeth out of the story.
They watered it down. Yeah.
And it was really unfortunate because what made that story powerful was the subversion of a lot of the tropes or the motifs, or the reversing them in some cases. And so to not do that and instead to kind of just go with the standard girl boss feminism instead, it just was really unfortunate.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
It's sad, isn't it? It's sad when it happens to books anyway, when you see a book that you loved so much and everything that you loved is gone from it. And doubly sad when it's an important message, when it's something that people could learn from, and that gets sacrificed.
But there's an opportunity with Snow White, and this is what I want to mention to people is definitely check out some of the adaptations for sure. And I know some of the ones you've mentioned, they're really, really interesting. But there's an opportunity for those who do like to tell their own adaptations with Snow White. As we talked about with the West African version, it only requires sometimes very subtle changes to become a very different story with a very different message. And also, if you think of the sleep metaphorically and the death metaphorically, which is this idea of being asleep to some fundamental truth and then awakening to that truth and then becoming whole, there's so much you can do with that doesn't make the character passive necessarily. It can just make the character so much more interesting. Or you can do what you've described also, which is sometimes changing the perspective. Maybe it takes the stepmother's perspective or whatever. So there's always a lot of room in these adaptations to take the bones of the story and do something really new and interesting with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the moment there is a really big surge of that happening, not just with fairy tales, with lots of things where experimental literature, and I think a lot of it is aimed at women. I think especially with things like Book Talk, there is an explosion of literature and retellings, or Greek mythology retellings aimed at women, queer retellings. At the minute is a boom on it, and I'm living for it. I think it's great, and it is, a lot of the time it is aimed at women. And you're absolutely right. One little tiny subtle change can create such an interesting way of telling a story. You've also got TV, things like Once Upon a Time, which people keep telling me to watch in the comments, and I've still not watched watched it. I've not watched it, guys. I've not
It's
watched it.
long. I'm only halfway through it. It's going to take a while to get all the way through, but I've liked what I've seen so far. It's good.
Yeah, I think I need to watch it. I think I will watch it. I'm one of these people where I can't sit still for very long. And I also can't turn my brain off for very long. So sometimes when I need to just sit down and I watch something, especially if it's a really long thing. Like I tried to rewatch Grey's Anatomy recently. I don't know how far I got. Not very far. I didn't get very far. It's just so much going on. I will watch it though. I will watch it. But I know Snow White is in that, right?
Yes, yeah. She's a primary character from the first episode. So yes,
is it Jennifer Goodwin?
Yes,
yes.
She's wonderful.
I know. She's very good,
the prince became her actual husband. So they got married.
Okay. Maybe I'll give it a go.
Yes, their chemistry is real. Watch it.
Well, that's good. If there's good chemistry, it's addictive viewing when it gets like that.
Yeah.
Snow White also pops up a little bit in music. When I was doing a little bit of research, I was trying to find references to her in music, and there's quite a few, especially in like the punk and indie space. I found something by the Dresden Dolls called Missed Me. And that references poisoned apples and themes of betrayal and control in relationships, which is definitely what we know to be Snow White. And also Bjork. A lot of Bjork's visual aesthetics has been interpreted as sort of taking Snow White and subverting it. It's like a fragile, like ornamental woman rendered sort of grotesquely divine. And then, the whole trope of being the fairest of them all, that pops up a lot in music, and it's often invoked to actually critique beauty standards. You got artists like Lana Del Rey, who are very much performative feminine melancholia, being this beautiful tragic figure, and you can sometimes draw parallels to that with lots of different fairy tales, to be honest with you. But I did read a few things. It was very loose though, so I'm not going to go into massive detail about it, but it was did some comparisons there. And outside of sort of media, you've got lots of feminist theory, which is provided really penetrating critiques of Snow White. Cassandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's The Mad Woman in the Attic of 1979 argues that the Snow White tale encodes this sort of binary between angelic and monstrous femininity. Snow White is like the ideal woman, passive and silent and beautiful, and the Queen is this mad woman whose punishment reinforces the patriarchy. And they write, and this is what we've just said about them being in the same oppressive cycle, the Queen is Snow White's double, her shadow, her dark sister, and an embodiment of her own suppressed anger and ambition, which is really interesting because, like, underneath Snow White's beauty and passivity, is she just the same as the Queen? Does she have all of that anger? Is what they're asking, I think.
The Enchanted movies from Disney actually say that explicitly, because they have the Giselle character, who in the first film is basically a Snow White figure, and she has the apple and whatnot. She eventually gets married at the end, and she becomes stepmother to I forget his name, but the character's daughter. And then in the most recent film, which I haven't seen, but I understand the basics of the story, she sort of is finding herself transforming into the evil stepmother. And it sort of becomes this identity crisis for her of, I was targeted by my evil stepmother, and now I am becoming the evil stepmother.
Yeah.
And who am I? And what is my relationship to this young girl? And so it really is interesting that they decided to kind of confront that head on with that story.
Yeah, it is an interesting take. I think, and I really enjoy takes on what happened after the fairy tale. I think that's when you can really unpick, you can go beyond that, like, especially for female characters, they are often quite one-dimensional, and to have an opportunity to explore more of them and more of their character development is really, really cool. I didn't know that the second Enchanted movie was about that. I didn't know that. I really loved the first one. I can't remember his name either, but we were just talking about Grey's Anatomy, so I'll
that guy.
McDreamy.
There you go.
I've seen the first one. I loved it. I've not seen the second one, so that's made me want to watch that. I'll put that on my to watch list. And there's also lots in sort of recent scholarship which has pushed that a bit further and explored queer theory, race and disability studies, exactly like what you said. Fairy Tale Femininities in 2014. That book, the author sort of traces how Snow White films from 1916 through to 2012 increasingly reflect more evolving ideas about womanhood, particularly as they shift from like the idealized passive woman to a resistance, sort of a figure of resistance. So yeah, and I can't not mention the 2025 live action Snow White remake. Everybody who listens to this podcast knows that I hate the Disney remakes very deeply. Listen, I've seen the trailers and that was enough. I have no interest in seeing it. I saw the dwarf's face pop up on my screen and I said, that's enough. And I closed my laptop. I can't.
And it breaks my heart for the actress. What's it? Rachel
Zegler. Yeah.
Yeah. Because she was treated so horribly. There was definitely a lot of racism in her treatment. Yeah. It just really makes me sad because I think she's an exceptional actress. And I just think that being attached to, frankly, such a bad project is just so sad because she deserves better and I think she can do better. So
yeah, I mean she's in Evita at the moment, isn't she, in the West End? I've seen her singing on the balcony. But I mean this Disney remake, it sparked masses of debate for the casting choices and the changes to the narrative, and it had a lot of feminist critics argue that it sort of attempted to frame her as an activist rather than a damsel. And again, that was superficial. It was superficially empowering. Right. And I think there's a quote that I've written down and I haven't written who it's by: feminist aesthetics without feminist substance.
Yeah.
But, some people did try and praise its effort to decenter whiteness and to challenge this like Eurocentric ideals of beauty that dominated earlier tellings. I think it's a similar thing to what happened with The Little Mermaid. Horrific racism. And I think that really kind of overshadowed the whole thing for lots of people because that's all the conversation was. I didn't mind. The Little Mermaid was okay, actually. I didn't mind it. But I just can't watch Snow White. I think I do know someone that went and walked out because it was just...
I didn't. I like the Brana Cinderella, and the main reason I like the Brana Cinderella is because he actually didn't try to remake the animated film. He just made his own Cinderella film.
That was the first one, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that was why I thought it worked pretty well, and I think it holds up now, actually. But all the others I don't love. Actually, I did like Little Mermaid. I will admit that I went to see that 3 times in theaters. And mostly just, I just thought it was, especially the scenes between her and the prince, they were so charming. And so that was where they just did a good job of, bringing something new to the adaptation. So it was sweet. But most of the Disney remakes are just atrocious. And I'm so sad, I guess, about what they did to Snow White because of the fact that, like we've just been discussing, there clearly is lots and lots of opportunity to do really interesting things. There is room to have genuine feminist storytelling of substance, even within this framework. You can do that. There is room for it.
And there's an audience for it as well.
Absolutely.
There's a massive audience for it. People want it. I mean, I think it's like something crazy, like 90% of you that are listening to this podcast right now are women. Mm-hmm. I'm sure pretty much all of you would love a really big, amazing, truly feminist adaptation of Snow White. You would eat that up. There's a big audience for it. So why isn't it happening? And that goes back to the patriarchy. That's on the patriarchy. We could talk for another few hours about that. But you're absolutely right. There's so many things that could be explored. There's so many avenues you could go down. There's so much that could be said and done about disability, about race, about everything. And it just doesn't get done.
Yeah.
And instead we have really horrific looking dwarves on my screen that make me scared. I don't think I could watch it because I really do think that I would have nightmares because they're so horrible.
Yeah.
Oh, they're horrible.
No, I can't. Yeah,
no, I'm glad it's not just me. So across genres, Snow White persists not because of its simplicity, but because of its complexity. The mirror, the apple, the coffin, each is a site of interpretation and reinvention. In the hands of modern writers, filmmakers and musicians and theorists, these symbols become instruments of critique, not only of the tale itself, but of the cultures that reproduce it. So, who is Snow White? Is she a victim? Is she a survivor? Is she a puppet of the patriarchy or a subversive symbol? Or is she all of them? there was a really interesting quote that I read by a scholar called Christina Bakilega, I think. Apologies, Christina. You probably will never hear this, but I'm trying really hard to pronounce your name. To read Snow White is to read the world, is what she said. Her story is endlessly retold and reflects our evolving beliefs about womanhood, ageing, justice and power. She is not fixed in a coffin of glass. She is alive in culture. She's always awakening. So that's all I have to say about Snow White today, I think. It's been really, really great. So thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the mirror. You're all the fairest of them all to me. That was really cringy. But thank you so much for listening. Missy, where can people find you? Where can people listen to more or read more of what you have to say?
I always recommend that people look for me on Tumblr, where I am All Girls Are Princesses. Appropriate name here.
Yeah, they are.
And so you'll find there I have essays on folklore interpretations, especially how they're changing in the modern era. And you can also find me. I am a frequent guest on the What the Force podcast, where we talk about folklore and fairy tales and mythology within Star Wars. So please look there.
Yeah, definitely do. Thank you so much for coming on today. It's been really cool to talk about this. We probably could have gone on for a lot longer because there's just so much good stuff to talk about. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please do follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. All of the links to all of my social media and everything is in the show notes. And like I said, we are going to stop this here and we're going to have another chat about disability in folklore and fairy tales. So that will be available over on the Patreon. So if you are interested in hearing that, then please do go along and listen. But I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore. Thank you very much. And thank you, Missy. I really, really appreciate you being here. Thank you.